His transcriptions and improvisations emulated and built upon the great tradition of his fellow countryman Franz Liszt, even though the communists literally tried to beat it out of him. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about György Cziffra. György Cziffra was born in 1921 in the shanty town of Angel's Court in the outskirts of Budapest, the capital of Hungary. His family was so poor that 2 of its members would end up dead of starvation. One of his sisters had saved and scrounged up enough money to purchase a dilapidated upright, and young György was absolutely fascinated. He was captivated by the sounds that this instrument was capable of making. It goes without saying that he did not have any formal training. Instead, he taught himself to play by ear. He saw what his sister did, and then he was able to mimic it perfectly. This talent for improvisation and of spur-of-the-moment transcription served him well, and it's his achievements in that field that are much better known than his achievements in composition. Inspiration for these improvisations, especially early on in his life, came from decidedly non-musical sources. He put this talent to good use at the local circus, playing improvisations and variations on popular tunes in order to help the family funds. However, this really didn't work out for all that long. He was viciously bullied and beaten by the other kids in his slum, and he also was very sickly, and between those two he just couldn't keep at it. At 9, Cziffra began formal studies at the Franz Liszt Academy of Music in Budapest. Cziffra was a grand pupil of Liszt. Although Liszt taught a great many students in his master classes, Cziffra's teacher, well, one of them at least, was actually a legitimate Liszt pupil. A lot of times, in order to get fame, those who would attend 1 or 2 master classes that Liszt gave would simply call themselves a pupil of Liszt for a resume item. So that became a little more widespread than the actual pupils that Liszt had, which were quite a bit to begin with. He stayed at the academy and concertized both in Hungary and in Scandinavia, until World War II broke out, at which point he was drafted into the Hungarian army. Hungary had allied themselves with the Axis powers, and Cziffra was sent off to the brutal Eastern Front. It would become infamous for Soviet forces' tendency to never take prisoners, and sending a soldier there was akin to a death sentence. A Nazi major general heard his playing by chance and saw to it for him to be transferred well away from the front lines into the heart of Germany, where he could entertain the higher-ups in the Nazi army. But before that could happen, the Soviets captured him. Now, the Russians did not have a real tendency to take prisoners, but when they did, they would issue this ultimatum: fight for us, or die. And Cziffra chose the former option. After the war, Cziffra was back in Hungary, still studying at the academy, except this time it was under communist rule, and he did not like it. A failed escape attempt in 1950 sent him to the gulags, where he was tortured for 3 years, including 10-hour shifts of picking up extremely heavy blocks that left his wrists in a state of constant, extremely painful inflammation. His captors inflicted this punishment upon him precisely because they knew of his profession. It took 6 months of grueling rehabilitation to get his fingers back into performing condition, and even though it's miraculous that he was able to do so in that short of a time, he still had to wear thick leather wristbands for the rest of his life in order to keep the swelling under control. Eventually he found his way to the west, to Paris via Vienna, where he became known for his fiery performances of some of the most fearsome pieces in the entire repertoire, specifically the works of his fellow Hungarian Franz Liszt. The passion and ability displayed at the keyboard, combined with the difficult circumstances of his life, made him a celebrity. His recordings indicate a level of liberty that he took with, well, the score. In the Lisztian tradition, he'd exaggerate the tempo or the dynamics in either direction in order to amp up the emotional affectation, or add in extra bits of difficulty for the sake of wowing an audience. The most famous example of this is probably his version of Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee, which is written in interlocking octaves. I sprained my wrist just looking at this. There is certainly evidence of a remarkable and perhaps unsurpassed technique, but the nature of his interpretations was rather controversial, to say the least. Because he added so much stuff and he took so many liberties, people thought he was just showboating. The thing is, this would have been seen as totally fine if he'd been a contemporary of Liszt in the 19th century. Liszt almost made this the de facto way for an uber virtuosi, such as Cziffra, to play a piece. However, in the 20th century, there was much more of an emphasis on what the composer wanted to do. That was really re-emphasized in such a way that Cziffra was just too far beyond the era in which he would have been better off. In the 1960s and 70s, in addition to concertizing, Cziffra dedicated time to founding opportunities for young musicians to learn their craft. These were festivals or competitions or grants, but either way, they all had one goal. In his own words, he wanted to spare young musicians the kind of misery that he went through. During this period, he became a citizen of France, with it changing his legal name to its French equivalent. In 1981, his son, György Cziffra Jr., died when his apartment caught fire. A possible suicide, although that has never been confirmed. After that, his father was so heartbroken that he swore off playing with orchestras anymore, because his son was a promising conductor. The solo performances he gave afterwards had less of a spark to them, which actually endeared these recordings to those who thought he was showboating earlier. Cziffra passed away when he was 72 years old, 13 years after his son's death, from lung cancer, brought on by his smoking habit. His performances are absolutely stunning in every capacity, and it's really hard to wrap your brain around the fact that a sole human being is responsible for everything you hear moment to moment. There's that much going on that you can swear there are 2 or 3 more hands knocking about on the keyboard. And even though these are by themselves incredibly impressive, they become even more impressive when you realize what he went through in order to bring this art to the world. He was lucky after his captivity to put together more than a few notes, but his willpower overcame it. And that alone is much more inspiring than any of the amazing recordings he ever committed to disc.